So this is a little constellation of related ideas that came up because I was talking about a couple of these elements and then the rest of them just... So I made a chart. Some common themes among a certain genre of media or art, and then connections to some stuff that I've been watching in John Vervaeke and actually Godel Bach, centering around miscommunication, especially between species, and like Lovecraftian horror and aliens and the post-apocalypse. Since I can't turn the camera around, I'm just gonna show it, or rather, since I'm lazy, I'm not doing editing right now, I'm just gonna show it and then talk about it. Hopefully the chart will stick in your head enough to give you a slight structure. So, interactions, communication or lack thereof between different species and sort of different orders and classes of beings. We were talking about Russian sci-fi novels, like one called Stalker and a different one that deal with sort of apparently this tone of being neck deep in chaos and having absolutely no idea what's going on, but being caught in the middle of it. And this one, I don't know what the book is called, but they made a movie out of it called Stalker. But they have the analogy of so there's some alien anomaly and some artifacts get scattered around and there's things going on across the planet. And somebody puts forth the theory that the aliens don't really have even any agenda for being here, etc. It's just as if some people had come into the forest, had a picnic, and the ants and the beetles and the caterpillars and whatever came out were staring in horror at what the picnic had left behind. Say, some random tools, a wrench, some scraps of food, some flowers from another meadow, etc. No rhyme or reason to it, but just the detritus of this whole other world that is way beyond the scale of these forest creatures, and in a similar way, whatever the aliens have going on is completely beyond our scope, and they didn't even notice us. And it also reminds me of this Tumblr post that compares the relationships between animals and humans to the relationships as people describe humans and the Fae. They're higher beings, right? They can grant you special powers or favors, but they're quite mischievous. If they do something for you, it's just because they happen to take a liking to you, being, trapped in their realm and coming out different, etc. There were some interesting parallels, but the skeleton of that being basically beings of a lower order interacting with beings of a higher order in different scales, which, since I am as ever obsessed with fractals, is an attractive idea to me. And I know that whole thing is basically Lovecraftian. When it goes wrong, I guess that would basically be... I've never actually read anything by Lovecraft, but this is apparently the theme of Lovecraftian horrors, beings that are not even malicious, but just too big to even know we're there, and could destroy us like we could destroy an ant. You understand why I'm so morally upset about these wasps, which I'm not going to do anything about them, but anyway. So, aliens. It also reminds me of Arrival, which I love. Arrival has a similar feel to it. And our varying, both Arrival and Ender's Game, I think, deal with this question. And those two are not, I would say, Lovecraftian as much, nor is the theme of them horror as much, but it's still the same theme of beings from completely different worlds encountering in some way, and the repercussions of that. I suppose in Lovecraftian horror there is really no communication, Whereas in Ender's Game and Arrival and a lot of other Alien movies, there is at least attempted communication. But it's the same type of thing. Let's see, where do I want to go from here? A lot of the times, these types of plots will involve artifacts that are incomprehensible to us, or barely comprehensible to us, or just like dangerous to us. Which is basically the Angreal or Terra Angreal from Wheel of Time. Wheel of Time also deals with ages, and so other civilizations who may as well be alien species for how different their world is from ours, have left behind scraps that some of them we don't know, some of them we like use for other purposes, etc. And I guess the modern, our equivalent of that, I was thinking about it because we don't have necessarily scraps of ancient technology left behind. But we do have a lot of ritual objects that we dig up and just like more ritual objects that do have power and certainly did like in their proper milieu and in their societies that they were originally, but now all of that has fallen apart and all we have is this artifact and we don't understand it. And your average modern Western person is certainly not equipped to deal with or interpret that. And so it's basically the same thing as if it had been some less technological civilization finding some piece of technology. We also find pieces of different kinds of technology that we also don't understand and treat much the same. So these artifacts that are like mysterious. And then we're trying to interpret, which reminded me of a bit from Gödel Bach about what meaning is, and meaning is just like a certain amount of complexity and a certain density of complexity that goes into patterns, into mirrors various other things, and that's sort of how meaning works. It's like all this network, to my understanding. But there's a sort of scale from an object with inherent meaning, as in like a lot of its meaning is sort of within the object, as it were. I mean, nothing can be entirely, it's a scale, right? Nothing can be entirely one or the other. But say a piece of music by Bach has more inherent encoded meaning in it than like random noise, or than like a Philip Glass piece or something. That may be a bad example. A piece with less structure, or just like a random pop song. The meaning of something like, or a child's, or something by like Rembrandt has more inherent meaning than like a child's stick figure drawing. So there's some artifacts that have meaning or that are used to communicate meaning where they're quite complex and the meaning is mostly, could be spoken of more in the object, where an alien civilization similar enough to Earth could perhaps decode them, versus ones where it's really just context dependent. Or like think of a meme that just depends on so many references and everybody's like, this is going to be incomprehensible in 10 years. It's not, now that I'm thinking about it, that scale's really breaking down to me, and it's not a very good, I don't know. But it's just an interesting way to think about how meaning is encoded and how much of that depends upon the context, the structure of our minds, the structure of our cultures and societies. And to me, at least, the takeaway, honestly, is that very few artifacts and things can contain like inherent meaning enough to be able to be decoded apart from a whole lot of like similarities. But it brings all of that to light. Anyway, it's something to think about when you think about random artifacts found from completely different civilizations. How much meaning are we going to be able to get from these? What does meaning depend on in general? But back to the more personal side of the whole different beings colliding, more different worlds colliding. A lot of the time these are post-apocalyptic settings, which are very cool settings. which makes me think of lachesism, the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows word. Lachesism is like the clarity of disaster. There's people who fantasize, quite a few people, fantasize about horrible situations where, like, the world has ended. And we're like, why? That doesn't seem like a sensible thing. But when you're in that kind of setting, everything's leveled. There's not all of this sort of arbitrary, speaking of inherent meaning and complexity and versus noise and whatever, there's not all of this, like, arbitrary infrastructure to life. Things are very clear. It becomes suddenly very clear what matters. So the clarity of disaster. And I suppose a connection between lachesism and these whole worlds colliding type of moments, which of course have happened among humans as much as they could happen among species, it leads us, like, the question becomes, what makes us human, / what makes us who we are, the people that we are, what makes us ourselves. How are we defining ourselves in opposition to these others, or in similarity to these others? How are we defining ourselves by the way that we react to these others, etc.? These types of events are always, like, challenging the self-identity of both sides, unless it's like the Cthulhu thing, in which case the one doesn't even know what's going on. But yeah, there's a lot of, like, existential questions to this. I mean, if you look at Arrival, it's quite depressing for the human race. This is totally what they would do, and it's really sad. Yeah, so it makes me think. I guess it's a moment of apocalypse. If I would pull this together and make a good essay, but it's just very loose right now. It's a moment of apocalypse in the sense of apocalypse and also of unveiling, or judgment, like it reveals who a society or a civilization or a species is by how they react. A lot of questions, a lot of Ender's Game deals with that a lot. Presumably Arrival deals with that a lot as well. And then you wonder about I guess that sort of hits in the question of how does one react to the other, which is there's a word that I want to look, it's like not intruding, incurring, I guess, on our world. Oh yeah, Slugcat too. Slugcat, beautiful game, quite haunting. Watched some reviews of it. Post-apocalyptic society and things. So that just fits the aesthetic of all of this. But anyway, as far as how to respond to the other. I guess in the end it's whether to fight them or not. And again, this is a little bit out of the, like, Lovecraftian horror scene now. This is presuming that there is some level of communication possible. It can be disastrous if you go in hostile and then later discover you just misunderstood and, like, messed something up. But on the other hand, it can be disastrous if you go in just willy-nilly and just, like, that's not the word. That word sticks out in my head because I remember it used to mean, like, whether you will or whether you won't, and there's just an interesting etymology, so for some reason that word's floating around. Anyway, whether you just go in all gung-ho and you just get destroyed immediately, even accidentally. So there's, like, a certain amount of boundaries and a certain amount of, like, defense, but it's like, how much? Where's the line? There's, of course, and this has to do with dealing with any kind of self-other interaction on any level. And so in this little constellation of thoughts, I'm just, like, going between all the levels. It's like, ooh, it's very interesting. Because it's the same patterns, but on such different scales and such different, like... Anyway, there's obviously the one extreme, which is complete, like, pacifism, complete acceptance of whatever. And Wheel of Time also deals with that, and I suspect will continue to that will continue to be sort of one of the threads going. It's spoilery, I can't completely discuss it, but there is a group in Wheel of Time radically devoted to peace, and they get taken advantage of, and they don't do anything about it, but it's a challenge, certainly, to the world, the way that they live. And anyway, they know how they take up that stance toward the other, just complete openness and refusing to do any harm or retaliation. On a metaphysical and very high level, I've been watching some John Vervaeke videos. He's been talking about, of course, participatory knowledge and all of this about, it's on a very, very abstract, very general level. All of this about trying to figure out the artifacts, trying to figure out the species, trying to communicate, interpreting things. It has to do with perception. And as I was talking about in that sparkling water video, to perceive something, and certainly of course to communicate with it, but even to perceive it, there has to be a certain amount of mirroring between you and the thing. If there's nothing at all between you to be a medium, then the thing would not be even able to be perceived. The more there is mirroring between you and the object, then the more that you can sort of perceive each other and interact with each other. And so therefore, to perceive something, to understand it, to communicate with it or them, this requires opening a space in you to let that in, to let in the other or the object. And this is the way to know something or someone or a new species or civilization which has incurred on you. And it sounds lovely in the abstract, but of course the reason why people aren't going around doing this is because it's rather tricky because of the aforementioned. This connects to Jonathan Pajot's video on the Far East, where he was saying when dealing with the stranger, there is a risk also of contamination. You're strange to each other, so possibly something about you may have a bad reaction with them or vice versa, whether intentional or unintentional. So even if you both come in intending peace and intending good, even just by being around each other, if you open a space up, it could potentially blow up in your face. Again, whether accidentally or because of somebody taking one or the other party taking an offensive attitude. So I guess, there's this thing of they have come into our world. Are we going to let them in? We'll let them in more because they're here already, presumably. How are we going to understand them? How far to open up? How much? Because of course, once you open yourself up to know something or someone, if you're doing it truly, that's going to be via love and via participation, which means that both of you are going to change. But then there's also always risk to consider of something going awry. Yeah. And alien human type of stories show this pattern very starkly, and cosmic Lovecraftian horror kind of stories. A lot of food for thought.